The wind howled through the dark, empty streets, carrying an unforgiving chill that sliced through the thickest layers of clothing. Snowflakes swirled in the freezing air, piling up on sidewalks, parked cars, and the deserted road leading out of town. It was the kind of winter night where people huddled inside their homes, safe and warm, unaware of what lay beyond their frosted windows. But outside, in the merciless cold, a heavily pregnant German shepherd struggled to move forward, her paws sinking into the snow with every step. Her breath came in ragged puffs, her body trembling from exhaustion and the cruel bite of the wind. She had been walking for what felt like hours, her belly swollen with the weight of the unborn lives she carried. Every muscle in her body ached, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not here. The shepherd, Riley, had once belonged to someone. She had once known comfort, warmth, and the gentle touch of a human hand, but that life had been ripped away from her in the cruelest way possible. It had happened earlier that day. Riley had been curled up in her usual spot in the sunroom of a sprawling mansion, the kind with high walls and a long, winding driveway that kept the outside world at bay. She had been dozing peacefully when the voice of her owner, Martin Caldwell, had shattered the quiet. "We don't need her anymore." The words had meant nothing to her at first. She had only perked up at the sound of his voice, expecting a treat, a pat on the head, something familiar. But instead, she had been led outside, lifted into the back seat of a sleek black car, and driven away from everything she had ever known. The journey had been long, and Riley had felt uneasy, but she had trusted him. He had fed her, cared for her, hadn't he? Then the car had stopped. The door had swung open, and in that moment everything had changed. She had been shoved out onto the snow-covered roadside. The door slammed shut behind her, the engine roared to life, and the car had disappeared into the distance, its red taillights fading like embers swallowed by the dark. At first, Riley had stood frozen in place, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She had waited, thinking, hoping, this was some kind of mistake, that he would come back for her, that this was a misunderstanding. But he never did. The realization had come like a crushing blow, a wound deeper than any physical pain she had ever known. The person she had loved, the man she had trusted with her life, had abandoned her without a second thought. A whimper had escaped her throat, but there was no one to hear it. The snow continued to fall, the cold seeping into her bones, but instinct had pushed her forward. She had to keep moving. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for the tiny lives growing inside her. Now, as she trudged through the endless white expanse, her body fought against the bitter cold, her vision blurring with exhaustion. Her once glossy coat was matted with ice, and her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to find shelter before it was too late. Just as the last bit of strength threatened to leave her, a flickering light appeared in the distance. A house, warmth, safety. With the last of her willpower, Riley staggered forward, leaving behind the footprints of a dog who had once been loved but was now utterly alone. Riley's vision blurred as she pressed forward, her body screaming for rest, but the faint light ahead was her only hope. The house stood at the end of a long driveway, its porch light flickering like a beacon in the sea of darkness. With every agonizing step, the warmth inside seemed further away, but she refused to give up. The wind howled louder, the icy air biting into her exposed skin. She shivered violently, her heavy belly making it harder to move, but something deep inside pushed her forward. Snow piled up against her fur, her legs wobbled, and exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. The storm was relentless, and for a moment she faltered, her body sinking into the snow. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her ribs rising and falling erratically. The puppies inside her shifted, a reminder of what was at stake. She couldn't stop, not now, not here. A sound pierced through the wind, a door creaking open. Then footsteps. Faint but deliberate. Through her fogged vision, she saw a figure step onto the porch. A man, bundled in a thick winter coat, stood under the glow of the porch light. He hesitated, his breath visible in the freezing air as he took in the sight before him. A lone German shepherd, barely clinging to consciousness, half buried in the snow. For a second, silence stretched between them. Then, the man moved. "Hey, girl," he murmured, his voice low and cautious. Riley lifted her head weakly, her muscles barely obeying. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. A small, pitiful whimper escaped her throat. She had nothing left. The man didn't hesitate. In 3 quick strides he was kneeling beside her, his gloved hands reaching out. His touch was warm, gentle but firm, as if reassuring her that she was safe. "Easy, girl. I got you." His hands slid under her body, and with surprising strength he lifted her into his arms. She barely had the energy to react. For the first time in hours she felt warmth pressing against her. The storm raged on, but she was no longer fighting it alone. The man hurried inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The sudden change in temperature made her shiver uncontrollably as the warmth of the house enveloped her. The scent of burning wood filled the air, and the flickering light of a fireplace cast dancing shadows across the walls. He carried her to a thick blanket near the hearth, lowering her carefully. The heat from the fire seeped into her frozen bones, and she let out a shaky sigh. "You poor thing," the man whispered, crouching beside her. His voice was filled with concern, his eyes scanning her fragile form. He ran a hand gently over her swollen belly, his brow furrowing. "You're pregnant." Riley let out a faint whimper, as if confirming his realization. The man exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand through his short, dark hair. "Who would do this to you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. His name was Daniel, a former firefighter, now retired, living alone in the cabin at the edge of town. He had seen his fair share of rescues, but nothing like this. Something about this dog, about the way she had fought through the storm, struck a deep chord within him. He grabbed a thick towel, carefully drying the melting snow from her fur. Riley flinched slightly but didn't resist. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if he understood how fragile she was. "You're safe now," Daniel murmured, his voice softer this time. "I won't let anything happen to you." As if she understood, Riley rested her head against the blanket, her tired eyes locked onto his. For the first time since she had been abandoned, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows against the wooden walls as Riley's body slowly relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. The warmth seeped into her frozen limbs, but the exhaustion ran deeper than just the cold. Her belly ached, a dull pressure building steadily, a warning that her puppies wouldn't wait much longer. Daniel sat beside her, his brow creased with concern as he gently dried the last of the melted snow from her fur. Every now and then, his hand would pause over her swollen belly, his fingers barely grazing the delicate curve of new life inside. "You must have been running for hours," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Riley's ears twitched slightly, though she was too weak to lift her head. Her eyes met his, soft brown pools filled with silent desperation, but also something else. Trust. Daniel sighed and stood, stretching his tired limbs before disappearing into the kitchen. The distant sound of cabinets opening and closing echoed through the quiet cabin. A minute later, he returned with a bowl of warm broth, kneeling beside her once more. "Here, girl," he said gently, holding the bowl close. The scent of the broth awakened a primal hunger inside her, but Riley hesitated. She had learned not to trust easily, not after the betrayal that left her stranded in the freezing cold. But Daniel didn't push. He simply waited, patient, unwavering. Finally, she lowered her head and lapped up the warm liquid, her parched throat burning with relief. Each sip seemed to bring her back a little more, her body regaining the strength it had nearly lost. Daniel exhaled softly, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Good girl," he whispered. But just as relief settled over him, Riley let out a sudden, sharp whimper, her body tensing. Daniel's heart lurched. Her sides rippled, and she shifted uncomfortably, her paws scraping weakly against the blanket. The air changed. He could feel it. This wasn't just exhaustion anymore. It was happening. His pulse quickened. He had dealt with emergencies before, had pulled people from burning buildings, had fought against time to save lives. But this was different. He wasn't a vet, and there was no hospital for miles. The roads were buried under thick snow. And Riley had no one but him. Okay, he murmured, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. He grabbed another blanket, folding it gently around her, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. Riley let out a low, guttural whine, her body quivering as another wave of pain rolled through her. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven pants. Daniel pressed a reassuring hand against her side. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're not alone." He glanced at the storm raging outside, snowflakes battering against the window like restless ghosts. The world was frozen, isolated. No help would come in time. It was just him and her, and the tiny lives about to enter the world. Riley whined again, her muscles tightening with effort. Daniel swallowed hard, bracing himself. The long night was only just beginning. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the cabin, all of Daniel's attention was focused on Riley. Her body trembled as another contraction racked through her, her paws flexing against the blanket. A soft whimper escaped her throat, and Daniel reached out instinctively, his fingers running along her side in a soothing motion. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, his voice calm despite the nervous energy thrumming through his veins. "You're doing great." He had never delivered puppies before, but he knew he had to stay strong for her. There was no room for panic, no time for hesitation. Riley let out a deep, shuddering breath, her ears twitching as another contraction came, harder this time. Daniel saw the tension in her body, the way her muscles strained. He had seen the same determination before in firefighters pushing through exhaustion, in people clinging to survival against all odds. And Riley was fighting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she labored through the pain, her body working instinctively to bring her pups into the world. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath fogging in the cold air despite the fire burning steadily beside them. Then, finally, a shift. Riley tensed, and with a final, exhausted push, a small, wet bundle slipped onto the blanket. Daniel's heart pounded. For a split second, everything was silent. Then, a tiny, fragile sound pierced the stillness, a faint squeak, barely louder than the crackling fire. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Carefully, he reached forward, using a clean towel to dry the tiny pup. It wriggled weakly, its tiny chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. "Hey there, little one," he whispered, the awe in his voice unmistakable. Riley lifted her head, her eyes immediately locking onto the newborn. Despite her exhaustion, she let out a low, gentle whine, instinct taking over. Daniel carefully moved the puppy closer, watching as Riley began to lick it with slow, careful strokes, her motherly instincts kicking in. Another ripple of tension coursed through her body. Daniel barely had time to register what was happening before another contraction hit. The process repeated, slow and steady, each moment laced with equal parts exhaustion and wonder. One by one, Riley's puppies came into the world, each arrival filling the cabin with a warmth that no fire could ever match. Daniel worked alongside her, wiping them clean, placing them near their mother, marveling at how something so small and vulnerable could fight so hard to survive. By the time the final pup had been born, Riley was spent. Her head rested against the blanket, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her eyes never left her babies. She nudged them close, curling protectively around them, her breathing uneven but filled with quiet relief. Daniel sat back on his heels, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. He was exhausted, but his heart swelled with something he couldn't quite name. Riley looked up at him then, her deep brown eyes filled with something that struck him to his core. Gratitude, trust, maybe even love. Daniel exhaled slowly, reaching out to scratch behind her ear. "You did it, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They're safe." Outside, the storm still raged. The world remained frozen and unforgiving. But inside this small, secluded cabin, life had found a way. The storm outside had begun to wane, but inside the cabin, the warmth of new life filled the air. Riley, though exhausted, lay curled protectively around her newborn puppies, her breathing steady but tired. The small bodies wiggled against her, their tiny cries blending into the soft crackling of the fire. Daniel sat nearby, his back resting against the couch, watching over them with quiet reverence. It was hard to believe that only hours ago, Riley had been fighting for her life in the freezing cold. Now, she was a mother, her instincts guiding her, despite everything she had endured. Daniel observed as she gently nudged each of her pups closer to her belly, ensuring they were warm and fed. Even in her weakened state, her devotion to them was unwavering. Daniel's fingers absently traced the rim of his coffee mug, his mind still replaying everything that had led up to this moment. The abandoned mansion, the heartless man who had left Riley to die, the sheer strength it had taken for her to survive long enough to reach him. And now, here they were. The weight of responsibility settled heavily in his chest. He knew he couldn't just leave her and the puppies to fend for themselves, not when they had fought so hard to survive. Riley had trusted him, had placed her faith in a complete stranger. He wouldn't betray that trust. As if sensing his thoughts, Riley lifted her head slightly, her deep brown eyes meeting his. There was something unspoken in her gaze, something raw and honest, a plea, a hope. "You don't have to worry anymore," Daniel murmured, leaning forward to brush a hand gently over her head. "You're safe here, all of you." Riley let out a soft, contented sigh, resting her head back down against the blanket. Max, who had been curled up at Daniel's side, stretched lazily before moving closer to the puppies, sniffing them with curious enthusiasm. One of the tiny pups let out a faint squeak, and Max's ears perked up. He hesitated for a moment before giving the little one a careful lick, his tail wagging slightly. Daniel chuckled. "Looks like you've got a babysitter already." The fire flickered, casting golden light across the cabin. Outside, the snow still covered the world in an endless white expanse, but inside, the cold seemed distant. A problem for another day. Tomorrow, Daniel would figure out the next steps. He would call the vet, make sure Riley and her pups got the care they needed. He would make arrangements to keep them safe, to give them a home. But tonight? Tonight was about survival, about warmth, about the quiet miracle that had unfolded in his small, isolated cabin. He took one last look at Riley and her puppies, a slow, contented smile forming on his lips. "You're home now," he whispered. And for the first time in a long time, he truly felt that way too. Riley's journey proves that kindness can change lives. If this story touched your heart, like this video, subscribe for more inspiring rescues and share to spread awareness. Have you ever saved an animal in need? Tell us in the comments.